Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. Before you on this table, I have 4 Mosin Nagants. Now, some people watching are going to look at that and see 4 old rifles. Some people are going to look at this and they're going to see 4 garbage rods, as some people call them. However, none of those are correct. What if I told you that on this very table, we can use these 4 rifles to track the lineage of the sniper program for the Red Army? Now, how are we going to do that, you might ask, Big Sam? Well, you see, it's very interesting and actually quite simple. A lot of sniper rifles used by the Red Army before, during, and after World War II were ended up being converted to standard issue 9130 rifles. These are what are known as X sniper rifles. And that's actually what we have here on this table. We have 4 X sniper rifles. So what we're going to do is take a look, going from left to right, earliest to latest, at each of these rifles and see what they can tell us. Let's take a look starting at this one here on the very left. All right, so let's take a look at our first sniper rifle of the day here. So this particular rifle is what's going to be known as the model 1931 PE sniper rifle. Now the PE sniper rifle was pretty interesting. The way it worked was it had a top mount that fit over the hex receiver right here, and it was affixed to the receiver via 6 screws in here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We can see those holes have been welded in, but these were once upon a time threaded. So we had a mount attached here, and on the mount on top was a dovetail. And then from there you could have put the that would have been called the base. From the dovetail on the base, you could affix a mount to it, and then that mount would be how you attach the scope to the rifle. So this was, again, developed around 1931. It's known as the model 1931. And the PE was started to, the production for it started around 1932. Now, for those of you who are already slightly familiar with X sniper rifles and standard sniper rifles, here we have a Tula arsenal, and typically we would expect to see what look like in English a C and an N over here. Now that was to indicate that this was a sniper grade barrel. Now this one doesn't have it, and originally the early ones didn't have that. So originally, they actually didn't have a separate production line for sniper barrels until around 1934. Once we got to 1934, the Tula factory had a separate production line created for sniper-grade barrels, so they could freely produce their barrels with better tolerances and better accuracy. So before 1934, up until early 1934, we would not see any markings here to indicate it was a sniper rifle. Starting in later in 1934 is when we would start to see that C and the N marking here. Now, this one is a 1935, and it still doesn't have that marking. So a good question to ask ourselves is why? And a good answer to that is, well, we don't exactly know. One of the possibilities is that the barrel here was replaced, but it's unlikely. If this was replaced, it most likely would have been a Wartime Izhevsk barrel. I've checked the receiver date on this one, and it's dated 1934. So it lines up with it. It's just a complete mystery why we don't see sniper markings on the barrel. Very interesting. Now, one other thing that the more attentive viewer may have noticed is right here. I'll point at it with my finger. Right here. See this weird, like defacement markings here? This is not normal to see. What actually happened was, when this rifle was created, a assembly number for the base was stamped on the receiver right here. And after this was converted back to a normal infantry rifle, that assembly number was erased. What's also cool, though, is it's not lost because they also stamped it under the recoil lug on the receiver. So it's actually still on the rifle, which is really interesting. Hopefully we'll get a chance to take a closer look at this rifle and maybe disassemble it another day, because it has a lot of interesting things to tell us. Now, around 1935, the Red Army was taking a closer look at this rifle, and it had some issues. So one of the main issues is that these were just 6 screws in here, and after shooting this, these screws would start to loosen. Okay, and these had to be screwed into a very specific spec. And if they started to loosen, that's a big problem, because then you're going to lose your zero, your point of impact is going to shift, and it's not good. And the Soviets did not have Loctite in the 1930s. So there was not a ton they could really do. So what they did was start to look for a different solution than this top mount in 1935. Okay, so now we understand what a PE sniper is. But let's take a look at where the Red Army went after the PE. Because, as we know, the PE had a few issues. So let's take a look at this guy. Okay, so the PE sniper had some issues. So what did the Soviets do next? Well, they looked around at what they already had. One of the things they had was a really interesting scope mount design that was currently being produced in Germany, and it was being used by the NKVD, the secret police. This was a really interesting mount. It was actually a side attach mount, and it was called the Gecko mount, and again, it was produced by Germany. So the Soviets started looking at that and said, you know what? This is a better option for us because it's going to have better accuracy properties, and it's going to be less prone to having your point of impact shift after shooting it a bunch. So how did this whole thing work? Well, if we open up the bolt here, what we can see is we have one little hole right here. Why do we have a hole here in the middle? Well, what happened was we had this specific big metal base that was attached to the receiver on the side here. And as they were developing this, right around this time, they actually switched over from the hex receiver, which was our previous rifle, to the round receiver, which is this rifle. So they actually had to modify that German-style base to work with the curvature of a round receiver, like this. So it's kind of hard to see. Let's see if we can get a closer look here. So on these Tula rifles, they had a big hole here that was threaded. They had a smaller hole here, which was up for a pin. Then over here was another hole that was threaded. And over here was another pin. If you actually look in here, I don't know if I'll be able to show it to y'all. It's going to be hard to see, but in here, you can actually see, if you look in the chamber, you can actually see the threads of the hole that was plugged for the other screw, which is really cool. So they affixed this big base on the side, and then they had this mount that dovetails onto it, and then there was like a locking screw that you could lock into it. So it worked better than the PE in the sense that, it was going to retain zero a little bit better. But it did have one issue. Mainly the difficulty of production of the actual scope mount itself. They had to machine it to very high tolerances, and even under peacetime conditions, it was pretty hard to do. So if we look here, there's our C and our N markings right here, okay? So that's what we'd expect to see on an X sniper rifle or a sniper rifle produced by the Tula factory before the war, the S and the N. And again, this barrel was made on a separate production line for sniper grade barrels, which is why it has those markings there. So even in the peacetime, they had difficulty making those scope mounts. So sometimes you'll actually see these rifles here with these markings, but they were actually never drilled here for the scope mount. They were actually never sniper rifles. Why is that? Well, the main reason is because they just didn't have the mount. So sometimes they would produce more barrels than they could mounts. And so they would go to produce one of these guns and, could turn it into a sniper rifle at the factory. And then they'd look around and say, wait, we don't have any bases in our scope mounts, in our inventory right now. So when that happened, they would just take these rifles and just, okay, whatever, we're just going to make this a standard infantry rifle. So sometimes you can see these markings on standard infantry rifles as well. So this kind of covers an overview of the Soviet sniper rifle production before the war. We had the PE and the PEM. And again, both of these rifles, all sniper rifles of the Mosin Nagant that were made before the war, were all produced by the Tula factory. The Izhevsk factory did not produce any sniper rifles before the war. Okay, so we've taken a look at the model 1936 PEM sniper rifle. But there's actually a little bit more to it than that. So, you see, in 1941, there was this thing called Operation Barbarossa, World War II, the Great Patriotic War. It was kind of a big deal. One of the issues the Red Army faced was, in 1941, after the Nazis invaded, currently there were no sniper rifles being produced. This was not really good, because what ended up happening was the Tula arsenal shut down production of the 9130 rifle in 1940. Now, they were still producing the SVT-40 in its sniper variant, but the Tula factory was shut down in 1941. So, at this point, a lot of horrible things are happening for the Red Army in 1941, and they're not currently producing any sniper rifle, which is really bad because they have a pretty big doctrine of snipers built around these rifles. So what do? Let's take a look at this guy and find out. All right, so the Soviet Union gets invaded by Nazi Germany on June 22nd of 1941. And it's just not a good year for them. And like we already mentioned, their sniper rifle program was completely shut down during 1941. And really the year before that as well. So what did they do? Well, they looked around and said, well, the SVT-40 is basically a no-can-do. At this time, the Tula factory was evacuated, so the only factory they had really making mass-produced rifles was the Izhevsk factory. And they weren't about to have the Izhevsk factory start making a whole bunch of SVT-40 rifles because, they had, quite frankly, they had to replace all of the Mosin Nagants that they lost, the millions of them that they lost in the second half of 1941. So, in 1942, it was decided that the Izhevsk factory and the Tula factory, because again, the Tula factory was able to resume production in 1942 as well, of 9130 rifles. So the Soviet Union said, well, we can't make the SVT-40 rifle because it's too complicated, so we're going to have to go back to the model 1936 PEM sniper rifle, because while it's kind of a pain to manufacture, it still beats having to mass produce SVT-40 rifles. I mean, we're already making Mosin Nagants anyway. So that's what they did. Both the Ijev's factory, starting around April of 1942, and the Tula factory around, I believe, February of 1942, resumed production of the PEM sniper rifle, the one that we saw before the war. So let's take a look at an Ijev's PEM sniper. Now, some of you might remember this rifle from the How to Build a 9130 rifle video we did. So this is, well, it's kind of hard to see. The dates all kind of been ground off here. And we can see there's also been some more interesting grinding right here. They ground off most of the serial number. You can, if you get the lighting right, you can kind of see some of the characters on it still. But this is a 1942 rifle. We know that because, see, it's an Ijev's factory. And if we open the bolt here, we can see our hole here in the middle. So that tells us this is a PEM style sniper rifle. Now, there's two holes here. Why are there two holes? On the Tula, there was only one hole. Well, see, one of these is a pinhole. And on the Tulas, they actually didn't drill all the way through the receiver for the pinhole. But the Ijev's produced rifles, they did. It's a little bit easier to do. So they just drilled all the way through. So that's why you actually see two holes here on the inside. And that's a really good way to identify, is this an Ijev's PEM sniper or a Tula PEM sniper? So these were started to be produced around April of 1942 by the Ijev's factory. And they only made them till around November. If we look here, what's really fascinating about this rifle is we know that this, based off of this prefix here, was actually made in October or November of 1942. How do we know that? Well, this T and an H here, we actually know that there exists 1942 PU snipers with that same prefix. There were only 2 months, October and November of 1942, that the Ijev's factory was actually making both the PU sniper as well as the PEM sniper rifle. So that's a really interesting tidbit. And as we can see here, we have this weird MO marking, which there's a lot of misconceptions about this, and we'll talk about that another day. But nevertheless, this is a really historic and quite interesting rifle. You can also see right here is where we can see that filled in pinhole. This front one was actually not drilled all the way through. Only the back one was. Quite a fascinating rifle. So, this is a good rifle. The model 1936 style mount had good reports from the troops. It was liked. The main issue was it was really difficult to produce the actual scope mount. The tolerances were crazy, and it was just not. It was a nightmare to produce. So, in 1942, the Ijev's factory was actually tasked with producing a new style of mount, one that's easier to mass produce and that's going to work just as well. Okay, so now we've got a better understanding of the Soviet sniper rifle production before and at the beginning of the war. But let's take a look at how all of this finally leads up to the sniper rifle that we're most familiar with, the PU sniper. To do that, let's take a closer look at this guy. Alright, so in 1942, the Ijev's factory was tasked with producing a new mount system. And it was formally adopted as the PU mount. It was called the Kochetov mount. That was the guy that designed it. It was called the PU Sniper, and the mount was called the Kochetov. But it was produced starting in 1942 by both the Ijev's factory and the Tula factory. So in 1942, they both switched to the PU Sniper production. Now, Tula switched a little bit later. The Ijev's started producing them around October. Tula didn't actually get production started until December. Let's take a look at a Tula. So as we can see here, This rifle was produced by the Tula factory in 1942. And one of the things you might notice here is our markings have changed. We used to have a C and an N, now we have a C and an H. Well, when the Tula factory, after they were evacuated, starting producing sniper rifles again, when they started marking them, they switched to this C and an H marking in 1942. So that's another way to tell if it's a pre-war or a post-war. Now, this is an interesting rifle. Well, it's got 2 serial numbers, which is weird, and we'll talk about that one for another day. But what's important here is the original serial number, this KO552. Well, KO is cool because this is the earliest known serial number prefix for a Tula PU sniper. So we know that this one was definitely produced in December of 1942. And that's just fascinating. Like, what was happening in December of 1942? Well, the big thing is the Battle of Stalingrad was raging. So it's very possible that this gun ended up there. And that was really the battle that started to turn the tides of World War II. Stalingrad, which really deserves a whole series of videos in itself, but that was basically the first time that the Nazis looked like they could actually be defeated. So it played a crucial role in world history, and it's neat to think that this rifle could have been a part of that. So we look here on the inside again. We can see we have our 2 holes here on the edges. So that's a good way to tell that this is a PU sniper. Remember, the PEM sniper has 1 hole or 2 holes, depending on who made it, here in the middle. These are on the edges, so this is a PU sniper. And on the Izhevs, again, carrying over from the PEM model, they drilled the holes for the base pins all the way through. But Tula, just like on the PEMs, they didn't. So on a Tula, you will only see 2 holes on the inside that were filled in. On an Izhevs, you will see an additional hole over here and 1 over here as well. So that's another good way to tell them apart. And what another really fascinating thing about this rifle is that 1942 PU snipers are actually rare. Now, I usually won't use the term rare in association with a Mosin. A lot of people will, and most of the time it's just not correct. Uncommon would be a better term. However, this rifle I would actually say rare because Tula only made around 2,000 PU snipers in 1942. They actually made about 3 times as many PEM snipers. So to find one of these is really fascinating. And it's just a really cool rifle. Here we could see our welded in holes again. Has a lot of neat things to tell us. Now I look forward to being able to take a closer look at all these rifles with y'all in separate videos and taking them out to the range and see how they shoot. But I'm glad that we were able to conduct an overview today of the sniper rifle program for the Red Army before, during, and after the war. Because again, after the war, a lot of these were converted back into infantry rifles, excuse me. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed getting to take a look at the lineage of the Soviet Union's sniper program through the eyes of just normal 9130 rifles. Hopefully, you've now seen that what may appear as a standard 9130 rifle may have a lot of interesting secrets underneath that you just have to take a closer look at it. One of the many things that makes these rifles truly fascinating. So I hope y'all enjoyed the video. If y'all are interested in more Mosin Nagant content, please consider subscribing. Please let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and I'll see you next time.